Hey, it's me, Corey from AP English, just catching up on this Heart of Darkness. And there's a lot of imperialism in this book, isn't there? That's what me and my partner Lena are here to talk about today. So we might as well start off with the Webster definition of imperialism. The definition is the effect that a country or group of countries has in changing or influencing the way people live in other poor countries. In our case, we're talking about Europeans and how they wished to humanize and make things better for the Africans in the Congo.
And so, as we saw in that quote that was in the beginning that I can't memorize, so we're going to replay right now. Conrad clearly saw that imperialism was supposed to be awesome, and clearly kind of thought that imperialism was awesome, because he used words like trade, which has this kind of connotation right here with like the Native Americans and stuff, and then he used words like improve, which has this kind of connotation, and instruct, which has this kind of connotation, like the wonderful teacher that Mr. Peterson is. And so those are all great things. And so imperialism clearly is a great thing. Right? Wrong!
As we can see from the history up here and the pictures here, things weren't so great for the Africans. There was actually a lot of cruelty going on that wasn't planned and wasn't really spread. So the Europeans were cutting off the hands and feet of children, like we say up in the history section, and basically everything was just not good. They were doing terrible things to make sure that the natives were extracting all of the materials that the Europeans wanted to make profit off of. So it was entirely not about, humanizing and making things better for the Africans. It was all based on Europeans just being selfish.
And as you can see from the history up there in the little area that we have about the natives, the treatment of the natives was actually really bad, and they treated them really poorly. And that is even shown in the book. So now if you see a man, like the manager that ends up saying that quote that we're going to put in this little section, so you'll have it there the whole time. If we see a man come up to, let's say you were there, and say something along the lines of that, and him fully knowing what was happening to the natives at the time, it was impossible not to know because he was in part of what was happening to them. Then you see the words like trade, and it becomes something more disgusting. It becomes something like trade is the idea that this ivory stealing and using them as a weapon, like that's something good. Like we're actually trading with them. And then there's the words like instruct, and you see that he actually believes that his instruction is taking over them and making them slaves in their own country. And so now we see these men who at first they use these great words to describe something awful that they're doing, and they seem even more disgusting. But so the question then becomes, was Conrad trying to show us that these men are actually these awful people and that they're inconsiderate and naive to what they're doing? Or was he trying to show us that they maybe didn't understand?
So we can think about this as being sort of similar to American imperialism. We were, hyping ourselves up as being heroes and, Captain America, great, awesome things. But really, we weren't really helping anybody. There was a lot of damage happening around us, and we were just, acting like we were these great heroes. Which also leads us into European imperialism with King Leopold II. King Leopold II was responsible for all of this occurring. He had originally promised that this was strictly for humanitarian reasons, and he created a philanthropic association, is what he called it, and he said that they were just going to look over the Congo and eventually hand the power over to the locals of that area once they were ready for this great responsibility, which never happened. He kept them controlling the natives the whole time. Another thing that King Leopold made was the International African Association, and he created this to basically, it was supposed to be, multinational and a bunch of different people getting together to figure out how they could solve the issues that were occurring in the Congo and how to make it a better place and all, but it ended up he just controlled the International African Association, and it was all just him, controlling, and he never really gave anybody else any sort of say in what was happening.
We see with the history that clearly the men in Europe were told and maybe even convinced that they were actually doing these things to help. And so let's take it back to the beginning of the book for a second. I know we're in part 2, but let's just take it back to part 1, to page 55. And I'm not going to read the whole quote. I have the book right here, page 55. It's a lesson, so you should have the book with you. Okay. it starts off with, it had known and served all the men of whom the nation is proud, from Sir Francis Drake to Sir John Franklin, knights all titled and untitled, and then it will go all the way down to the dreams of men, the seed of commonwealths, and the germs of empire. That's going to be a whole page. I'm not going to read the whole thing. But this quote really showed the idea that these men thought that the men that were imperializing were these powerful, great guys that were helping these people. And so that kind of brings the idea that there are two ways to see what Conrad was trying to say. He could have been saying one side of it, which is the idea that these men were awful and they knew what they were doing and yet they were ignoring what they were doing. Or we could be seeing these men who were told that they were doing something great and had to convince themselves that. So these men were either lying to themselves or just saying these things because they couldn't care less about the results. So this brings us to the conclusion, where we're going to introduce the most in question, the overriding question of the whole video, which is Marlowe's obsession with lying because he really hates how all these men are doing this in relation to imperialism. And then also, the second overriding question is, if we see Marlowe as a kind of extension of Conrad's ideologies, then is Conrad showing with this whole Heart of Darkness book how he really hates imperialism?
Mm-hmm. And by all of this, and by all of the history we said before about how the Europeans were truly just, being cruel towards the natives and really not doing anything that they said they were going to do, we can see that Conrad really infused this into his work, along with other novelists at the time, because it was such a terrible time. So if you have any other questions, please feel free to ask us. And
read the rest of the site.
Keep reading the rest of our site.
And read the rest of everyone else's sites, because these lessons are important.
Mm-hmm.